Pope Francis is a prophet. He's a geopolitical prophet. And as the discussion today is about lost universalism, he rings an alarm bell. He was meeting some days ago with a group of young people, and he said, it is not possible to build a society on hatred. Remember what happened in the 20s of the last century. In those days, the discussion was about race. Today, it is about migration. Francis is a very special prophet. He's a little bit like the old Jewish prophets who were walking around. He comes to the European Parliament and says, you politicians, you legislators, have the mission to care about the fragility of peoples and persons. He comes to the United States and remembers, I too am a migrant. Don't forget that this continent has flourished, has had its growth because there were migrants. And he comes to the US Congress and says, today it's a time of violence, of terrible violence, of atrocities, of religious fundamentalism and other fundamentalisms. But he says we must resist the temptation to polarize. We can't and we have not to divide in a primitive way, here is the good and there is the evil, or the righteous and the sinners. Francis comes to Bangui, the capital of the Central African Republic, to open the Jubilee of Mercy, which always was opened in Rome, but he goes to Africa, he goes to the heart of Africa, and on his Papamobile, he takes the Imam, the Muslim Imam of Bangui. Pope Francis comes to South Korea, and on his white cassocks, he puts the yellow ribbon of the Korean sex slaves, the so-called comfort girls, during the Japanese occupation. It is evident when he goes around the world or when he speaks in Rome that it's a religious leader who doesn't make proselytism. Francis has said also very tough words against proselytism. He says it's stupid to make proselytism. You have to attract because of your capacity to be witness of what you believe, of the values in which you believe. And he doesn't come as owner of truth. He doesn't speak from the pulpit. He doesn't speak like a representative of a hierarchy who gives from above truth to the people, to the persons, to the different personalities he meets. Of course, he has religious roots, but his approach is like to speak as human amidst other humans. It is not a truth which comes from above, but it is the effort to foster what he calls the universal family and to foster it from below. What does it mean, below? Below means the reality of the daily events, the reality of the daily events which we can see or sometimes we don't want to see. There are two key words in his activity. The first keyword is to walk around, to work in the daily life. And the second keyword is to listen. So to walk not like an emperor. You know that even now when he goes somewhere, he has very little car, like middle-class cars, not big cars. to walk around not like an emperor, but like a disciple of Christ. You remember, if you have read the Gospel, Christ was always walking from one village to the other, and the disciples behind him, they walked on dusty roads. And Galilee at those times was already a multi-minded society. There were not living their own Orthodox Jews only. There were Jews and Samaritans and Romans and Greek-educated people. And Francis comes from a street experience. When he was Archbishop in Buenos Aires, he refused to live in the Archbishop Palace, and he refused to have the driver, and he was going around by bus, by tube, suburban trains. And it was not just so, to be a populist. But if you have this rhythm, if you spend the day in the tube, in the bus, waiting for the suburban train, you have a very different look on society, on the different situations on society. And since the moment when he became Pope, he always said the church has to go to the periphery. The church can't be self-centered. And just because he says that the church has not to be self-centered, he has already many enemies, as you know. Francis has a sense of humor. When he was elected, he said, "My brother cardinals choose me from the end of the world." But it's a joke. Buenos Aires is not the end of the world. Buenos Aires is a million city. Buenos Aires is a metropolis. The core of Buenos Aires is 3 million people, but the greater Buenos Aires is more than 10 millions of people. Buenos Aires is not a Bavarian village. Buenos Aires is not a Polish province town. Buenos Aires is not a nice Italian town where all are Catholics. Buenos Aires is a multi-ethnic town. There are the descendants of Spaniards, descendants of Italians, Russian, Swedes, Lebanese, Arabs of other countries, Asiatic people. Buenos Aires is a multi-religious million city. There are Catholics, there are Protestants, there are Jews, there are Muslims, there are strong evangelical and Pentecostal movements. There is a strong tradition of Freemasonry, so a strong anti-clerical tradition. And so he has always lived in a milieu where there are people of different thinking, of different minds. He has never imagined, for instance, he has never told that a non-believer, an atheist, is a sort of lame duck. He has never had this idea. There are these people with different minds, with different cultures, are on the same level. They are all different and all citizens. And Buenos Aires is a million city where you can see all the different social, economical situations. You have well-endowed people who have middle class, you have rich, you have super rich, like who live in compounds like you could find in the United States. You have poor people, you have very poor people, you have slums, you have shanty towns. And these shanty towns are like a European province towns, as large they are. 25,000 people, 40,000 people, 60,000 people. Terrible towns, full of railings. You, on the windows, you ask, but why? There is poor people and so many railings on the windows, in the shops, everything. So you feel violence, and you feel also solidarity. And these situations he has lived and experienced personally. So when he speaks about the outcast, it's not that he has read in the newspapers, that he has seen in television, that he got a dossier from somebody, from some office who gave him a dossier. He has experienced personally what it means to be outcast. And you feel this experience when he speaks about the care of a common home. And when he speaks as a geopolitical personality and in the same time as a religious personality who has learned very well the lesson of the famous speech of the Beatitudes of Christ, when he said, "Blessed are the poor, blessed are the thirsty, blessed are the hungry, blessed are those who are hungry of justice." Walking around and asking questions. You could define his mission in this, to walk in the reality and to ask questions and to remember to everybody, to people of different cultures, of different beliefs, some crucial questions. And the first question is, what happens in nowadays world with the excluded? Are we aware of the millions and hundreds of millions of excluded who live near us? I mean, sometimes he says, well, when he's in the center of Rome for some ceremony, maybe you have seen the pictures of the Spanish stairs, so beautiful, and he says, look, but Rome is not just only a nice picture, a postcard you can send to your friends if you are a tourist here. Don't forget that here are people who die. Not far from the Vatican, people dies. And when in the winter time there were people who have died just near the walls of the Vatican City, he wanted to make a funeral with the cardinal, just to underline the dignity of these people who are forgotten probably by most of us. In the last 20 years in India, 300,000 peasants have committed suicide because they can't pay the debts. I remember studying Roman history. I remember the problem of the people who couldn't pay debts, and then there were revolts in ancient Rome. And everybody thinks this belongs to the past. We have read the things about the past. No, it is part of the present. And the widening gap between poor and super rich, the Pope reminds, is something of nowadays. And the gap is widening from year to year. You all know probably this great NGO Oxfam, and Oxfam makes every year a report. So in the year 2014, when I began to write the last biography about Pope Francis, there were 85 individuals who were owner of the same of half the poor of the world. 85 individuals were possessing what is possessed by 3 billion and 600 million of people. But 1 year later, in the year 2050, it was already only 65 persons who were owning what the other half of the world population is owning. And nowadays it is only 42 people. And if we read about increase of wealth, more than 2/3 of this increase goes already to the super rich. Pope Francis has once said, well, they have always told us about the so-called trickle-down economy. It goes well for the rich, and then something comes also for people who are less endowed. But then, with sense of humor, he said, well, it's like a glass, you put the water and then it pours out. But strangely, the glass is growing always, and it never pours out. So the first question he puts is, do we listen to the cry and to the scream of the excluded? And when he went to the Congress of the United States, he said, we have to remind the words of Martin Luther King. There is a promissory note to pay to the excluded. And the second question he asks in the modern world is to think, to reflect about the new slavery. Slaves are not only in the times when pyramids were built. By the way, pyramids were not built by slaves. There were very well-paid people who got meat, who got even beer, as we can read in the papyrus scrolls. But slavery is not something who belongs to old times, to Roman times, or also to the times in the American continent. If we see the film Gone with the Wind or The Hat of Uncle Tom, slaves are existing now. You have sex slaves. 30 million of people moved from one continent to the other for the sex industry. Women, men, children. You have labor slavery. You have underpaid slavery. You have precarious jobs. You have millions of people who need to have 3 jobs to make 1 salary. And his desire during the presidency of Barack Obama was to reach an UN agreement, UN compact on slavery. Now times are changed. There will be no document on that, but this is one of his aims. And we come to the third issue, which is put by Pope Francis. His first trip when he was elected Pope was not to a great nation or to a great city. It was to a tiny island between Italy and Africa, the Lampedusa island, because he wanted to meet migrants. Millions of migrants are moving from one continent to the other. Nowadays we see it again and again at the US-Mexican border, and we see it above all in the Mediterranean. And Pope Francis is saying we can't tolerate that the Mediterranean has become a graveyard, an immense graveyard. And you can't solve this problem with walls or with police forces. And he underlines, millions of people are not looking for a better life, they are looking just for life. This we can't forget. Of course, it is needed a real effort by states, a program, a political project. The Pope doesn't give receipts. The Pope puts issues, puts questions. So the states and the nations have to work out programs in order to receive these people, to integrate these people, to respect the identity of the inhabitants and to foster rights and duties. But you can't resolve this central issue of nowadays world only just closing down borders and hoping that walls and police solve the problems. Or you send the military like Trump is doing these days, the American President Trump. Because the Pope says we are now not in a change, an age of changements. It is a changement of era. It's an epochal change. It's a complete change of the world situation. And of course, he hopes very much, he puts hopes in the role of Europe. Already John Paul II, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, called to Rome the bishops of Europe to reflect on the events and on the after events. And already John Paul II was underlying Europe must not be a fortress. Europe must remember that its growth, its culture, its role is based on the coming together of different peoples, different cultures, different mentalities, different experiences. So for Pope Francis it is important, it should be important for Europe, he has said it many times, to have a dynamic of integration. And most interesting of all, I think, is also the ecological issue which Pope Francis has put with his encyclical, Praised be the Lord. By chance, we have to remember that it was just here in Berlin in the year 2011 when Pope Benedict came that he said that the ecological movement, the Greens, were bringing fresh air to the political life of Germany and of Europe. And for Pope Francis, what is interesting is that this is an encyclical which is addressed to everybody. Encyclical are documents of the popes which generally are addressed to the bishops, to the believers. John XXIII, in his famous encyclical Peace on Earth, was addressing, and it was a sign that he wanted to overcome the Cold War, he was addressing his encyclical to all humans of goodwill. But Francis is also going beyond this definition. He said, this is encyclical for all those who care about the common home. The world is a common home, and we all are citizens of this common home. So this is an encyclical in which the thought and the discourse of the encyclical is not going from the dogmas to what people has to do, but it's just the opposite. It begins with the analysis of the science achievements. And only after the analysis of the science and achievements, it comes to the ethical responsibility of everybody. In this encyclical, Francis asks crucial questions. What happens to the environment, but not only the environment seen as physical nature, but the social environment, with the meltdown of the polar ice, with the climate changing, with the desertification, with the destruction of tropical forests, with urban pollution, with ocean pollution. What is the social impact? We can't forget that, for instance, desertification brings millions of Africans to leave their countries and trying to come to Europe. So there are migrations with the natural environment destruction, social deterioration, poverty and violence. Francis, in his encyclical, and I want just to quote some of his words, say that the global change affects social exclusion, inequality in disposal and use of energy. It has an impact on social fragmentation, on increase of violence, on new patterns of youth aggressivity, on loss of identity. And so in this encyclical, he links environmental deterioration with social deterioration. And of course he asks, what is the role of religions in this? The role of religions, as comes from their tradition, is to remember that the earth is a gift and there has to be a common responsibility for this common good. And beyond religious tradition, coming again to this sense of universal family, as he has told some days ago, is to care about this common heritage. And politics and politicians have to understand their responsibility for the common home. And they have not just to bend under what Pope Francis says, the so-called technological and financial paradigm. This can't be only financial or technological interests who guide politicians and people in caring about the common home. I want to end this short resume remembering the last wound where Pope Francis, as geopolitical prophet, puts his finger. The religious fundamentalism and the wars which are produced by religious fundamentalism. Pope Francis has spoken about the Third World War in bits and pieces. This is a very subtle thought, because it means that it is not that just there and there in Africa, in Asia, it can be in Moscow, it can be in Paris, it can be in Sweden, there are explosion of violence. But there is a link, there is a framework. And before finishing and addressing this problem just in a polarized way, and Francis says you can't only think in good and evil, Francis puts some uncomfortable questions. Who is financing these people? Who bought the oil they were selling? Who provides weapons? Who helps politically? Or who turns away the head when something happens beyond the borders? And when he speaks about a Third World War, he reminds us through the lines. And when you have Vatican documents or Vatican speeches, you must always read through the lines. He reminds us what was the turning point of World War II. The turning point of World War II was the moment where all the forces, also different forces, were united on international way to fight the Nazi regime. So if you have to fight and to overcome this evil, you must have an integrated effort under international framework, under UN framework. During his visit in the United States, he reminded in a very diplomatic way, but in a very clear way, don't forget unilateral moves don't bring good, bring evil. You can't think only in the dimension of spheres of influence. There must be an integrated international effort to overcome the evil of violent fundamentalism. And he ends also with another thought that he never spoke, even when there were attentates, assassinations in Europe, even when a priest was killed in France at the altar, he never speaks defending his victims, Catholic victims or Christian victims. He cares always about all victims. He says in the Middle East, first of all, don't forget that the great majority are Muslim victims. And he had the courage to repeat it here in Europe after big attentates, after large attentates. But he says, Muslims, Jews, Yazidis, Christians. They are all sons and daughters and children of God. So once again, he, in his approach, is universalistic. So we can't say how all this enterprise will end, but it is very clear that he is a universalistic prophet. Thank you very much.
Меня зовут Михаил.
Hello, I'm Mikhail Krasulin. I'm from Russia, Yaroslavl region on the Volga. My question is, it's well known that for our common European home, one of the serious problems is corruption. So Pope Francis several years ago literally declared a war on the mafia, declared a war on the corruption, first of all in Italy, in Sicily, and called on his bishops, that is the servants of his, literally to excommunicate, to deny communion to the notable mafiosi. Hence, I am from Russia. Corruption is very serious in our agenda. We have not had such experience, so that our religious leadership would literally declare a war on the mafia or on corruption. Tell me, please, what it all ended in, or is this war going on? Where does this all end in about this literally war declared by Pope Francis on the mafia? Because as far as I know, that some observers were asking a question, will Pope stay alive after this? Will he not again have to face an attempt on his life because of his tough position on the mafia?
Good morning, Dragan Nikolic, Croatia. Coming back to that of your thoughts that finally we are having a prophet or a pope not from Bavarian village and that he is universalist prophet. Would you say that in a moment when Europe is in a big crisis of values and we are witnessing the big rift between liberal democracies and something that is called conservative democracies or patriotic democracies with Orban and all the others in Europe, that even having a conservative religious position, but being universalist, a prophet, pope, actual pope has a chance to be, someone who is not drifting apart, but it's including, and that he is inclusive and being pretty much in this moment the only statement in Europe, although religious leader.
Kristina Lagulyan, Yerevan School of Political Studies. You talked about religious fundamentalism and also world faces the terrorism. So what do you think, which are the mechanisms to soften this problem and overcome? And is it possible to have a real dialogue with the representatives of this religious fundamentalism and terrorism?
The first question about mafia. Of course, mafia is an Italian word, but the criminal organizations are all over the world, from Asia to North America to Russia to South America. What was something special in South Italy is that the mafia, for decades and centuries, for the mafiosi bosses, it was very important to be accepted in their environment, in their village, also by the religious authorities, to stay in the first seats in the church during the mass, to be specially welcomed by priests and by bishops, to show that they were the owners of the situation in the religious field and also in the civil field, So in Palermo, for instance, you had years ago the opening of a Renault shop, and the owner was the wife of a mafiosi boss, and you had all the civil authorities of Palermo there for this opening of a shop. There was no reason that you had the prefect, the chief of the police there. So they want to show their power. And in this sense, Francis has called to be absolutely intransigent, to have no weakness in saying, no, you are not only out of the church, you are excommunicated. This was a very important signal. This doesn't mean that the situation changes everywhere immediately, but there were more and more bishops who, for instance, prevented the cross march, which you have sometimes for the patron or at Easter in a little town. The statue of the Madonna, of the Virgin, or of the saint was stopping before the house of the mafiosi boss, just in sign of respect. It is a social power play. And so you have more and more bishops who have prevented this, who have forbidden this. And it was very important just months ago when one of the greatest mafiosi bosses, Totò Riina, died, that the Bishop of Monreale said, you can't have public funeral in the church of the little town. You can have a private mass. And I too will come to celebrate the private mass, but you can't have a public mass. This was a sign of this cultural war against mafia. And of course, in different situations, in different cultures, in different nations, every nation must choose, every civil and religious authority must choose the way they fight these criminal organizations. About democracy, just a few days ago, the Secretary of State of the Vatican, Cardinal Parolin, was remembering the importance of the Declaration of the Rights, not only in France in the year 1789, but by the United Nations. And it was showing how more and more the Vatican had embodied, had accepted this idea, and is now working for the fostering the civil rights and the democratic rights. For the Vatican, it has become difficult today to act on the international level because the situation has changed very much. Vatican, for instance, had always relations with the United States, for instance, with Republican president, with Democratic president. Actually, with this new presidency, which is completely different, it is very difficult for the Vatican to have dialogue. And it has become difficult for the Vatican also to understand what is happening, not only in some Eastern European countries where there are the so-called unliberal democracies, but also in countries in Western Europe where these xenophobic populist movements are growing and growing. And in Italy, for instance, now we have them in the government. One of the vice presidents, vice premier of Italy, Mr. Salvini, is the leader, the strong leader of a populistic, xenophobic, anti-migration movement. And what is interesting is that these leaders in the same time, you have it very clearly in Hungary and in Poland, for instance, want to be the representatives also of the real Christian people. And in Italy, you see that these people, when they speak about religion or when they come also to political meetings with the cross and say we must defend our Christian identity, always have the position of the enemies of Pope Francis. I mean the theological position of the enemies of Pope Francis. So we are in a situation where in the Catholic Church you have a sort of civil war going on. And in Europe, you have not only the problem, as it was the first statement we saw on the video message, of the transition to democracy, but we have today also the problem of transition from democracy to a weakened democracy. The last question was about fighting fundamentalism. Pope, first of all, about Bavarian. I was speaking about popes from a Bavarian village or a Polish little town like John Paul II or Benedict. All popes are I mean modern popes, are universalistics. But what is important in the personal experience is that Francis doesn't come from an all-Catholic environment, that he had this multicultural experience. And this also explains his attitude to the multicultural modern world. Pope Francis is systematically fostering dialogue between religions, between inside Christianity and outside Christianity. So he went, for instance, in October 2016 to Sweden to celebrate the Lutheran reform. So the enemies of the Pope said, you have nothing to celebrate because the Lutheran reform was splitting Christianity, Western Christianity. But he went there just to celebrate, saying these are common gifts for our common history. You know that he succeeded, John Paul II didn't succeed, Benedict didn't succeed, succeeded in having the meeting with Kirill, Patriarch of all Russia, fostering again the direct dialogue between Catholic Church and Orthodox Church, and saying also in that occasion that proselytism is not a solution because cooperation is a solution. And he went to Cairo to the Sheikh of Al-Azhar, which is a little bit called the Sunnite Muslim Vatican, because it is a very old center of elaboration of the Muslim Sunnite thought, just to have personal dialogue with the Sheikh Al-Tayyeb, but also with the Iranian president Rouhani to underline the relations between the Shiite Muslims and the Catholic. And what is interesting is that President Rouhani asked Pope Francis, pray also for me. Thank you.